In the year 1066, England is facing a crisis. In Normandy, King Harald Godwinson waits for the enemy to cross the English Channel, fearing an assault from the south. Then one of Europe's most dreaded commanders posts a 300-ship force near the shore. But this army is Norwegian, not Normandy-born. Once again, the feared Vikings have returned, and this time their captain wants to take the crown. Who is he? Who was the last great Viking? Harald Hardrada. Around the years 1015 or 1016, in the southern Norwegian town of Ringerike, a man by many names, Harald Sigurdsson, Harald Hardrada, and King Harald III of Norway, came into this world. King Sigurd Syr was his father. He was a minor king of Ringerike in the Norwegian province of Buskerud. The first unification of Norway's realm, King Harald Fairhair, who supposedly reigned for decades in the late 9th and early 10th centuries, is thought to have been his great-grandson. So Harald the Younger was born into a long line of royal lineage that began with the first king of a united Norway. Asta Gudbrandsdatter was Harald's mother. She wed Sigurd Syr not long after her first husband, the king of Norway's Vestfold area, Harald Grenske, passed away. In the house of his foster sister, Sigrid the Haughty, who he had intended to marry in order to inherit her rich inheritance, Grenske was assassinated as he slept. King Olaf II of Norway was born to Asta and her first husband, Olaf, when he was around 20 years old in 1015, about the year when Harald was born. Aside from Harald's half-brother Olaf, Harald had multiple older, full-blooded siblings, including a sister named Gunhild, 3 brothers named Halfdan, Ingerid, and Guttorm, and a plethora of children from her second marriage to Sigurd Syr, Harald's father. It was common practice at the time to change a person's family tree after their death in order to legitimize their descendants' claims to the Norwegian throne, so some historians have begun to doubt Harald's paternal lineage. The Icelandic sagas state that Harald and his half-brother Olaf were both supposedly descended from King Harald I, or Harald Fairhair, the first king of Norway. It is also believed that Sigurd Rhys, Fairhair's son, was Harald I's great-grandfather. Nevertheless, the veracity of Hardrada's family tree is still up for discussion, since there is no conclusive proof to support the veracity of several Norse sagas. What little is known about Harald Hardrada's life comes from a variety of sources. The accessible sources provide wildly varying types of information based on when and where they were published. And although certain aspects of his life are rather well documented, others are far less so. Very little is the world. Heimskringla is the name of his composition. Harald is mentioned quite a bit in this history of the Norse kings of Sweden and Norway. The Russian Primary Chronicle, a collection of annalistic chronicles detailing the history of Norse settlements in Eastern Europe, including Kievan Rus and other locations in Constantinople, is helpful for his time in Eastern Europe and Constantinople, while the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and the Bayeux Tapestry are priceless for his time in English politics. Notable among these historians and chroniclers is Adam of Bremen, who lived in the northern German city of Bremen and wrote an ecclesiastical history of the area, bridging northern Germany and Denmark in the late 11th century. Nearly Harald's contemporaries, Hardrada, whom Adam called the Thunderbolt of the North, was heavily involved in Adam's life. There is less evidence from which to piece together Harald's early life. Even as a young man, the Icelandic poet Snorri Sturluson noted that he was taller and stockier than other men his age, with light-colored hair, a thick beard, and a mustache. When the Norse migrations to Scandinavia peaked in the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries, there was no system of formal education in place for the Vikings or Norse people. The children of the nobility and local elites, such as Harald, were instead taught by scholars who served in the royal courts. Historians like these would have told Harald tales of Norway's legendary Norse warriors and explorers, as well as the more verifiable raiding parties and settlement conflicts that had occurred in places like England, northern France, and along the great rivers of Eastern Europe, like the Volga, Dnieper, and Don, since the 790s AD. Although Harald would have spent his formative years in a Viking longhouse, he would also have spent time at sea, studying to become a Norse warrior, and traveling aboard a Viking longboat. Even though he grew up in a Christian household, his father had converted while he was alive. There were also non-Christians who practiced polytheism and worshipped ancient Norse deities like Odin and Thor. Harald would follow in the footsteps of his half-brother Olaf and other Vikings who ventured far from home in search of glory and riches on the high seas. It is impossible to understand Harald's life without placing it in the broader framework of Norse and Viking history from the 9th to the 11th century. The Norse started to spread outside Scandinavia in the late 7th century AD. In the beginning, groups of Norsemen from Denmark and Norway would go on raids in northern France, England, Scotland, and Ireland, bringing slaves and plunder back to Scandinavia. The Swedes, on the other hand, would mainly do the same thing, but they would use the great rivers of Eastern Europe, like the Volga, Don, and Dnieper, to attack Byzantine and even Arab towns on the Pontic-Caspian steppe. The Norse warlords' expeditions became more focused on expanding their kingdoms via conquest. A number of powerful Danish and Norwegian warlords had already taken control of various regions and cities around the turn of the 10th century. These included Dublin in Ireland, Northumbria and East Anglia in England, Normandy in northern France, and Novgorod, Staraya Ladoga, and Kiev in Eastern Europe. Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, was besieged many times by the Norse. Over time, the Byzantine emperors even resorted to employing Norse military bands in order to ward off the Norse pirates based in Kiev. Constantinople gave them the name Varangians, which means pledged sword companion in Greek. Around the same time, in the late 9th and early 10th century, the Anglo-Saxon rulers of the Kingdom of Wessex successfully defeated the Danish invaders and united England into a single kingdom. However, by this point, tens of thousands of Danes and Norwegians had settled across England, resulting in a mixed Anglo-Saxon and Norse population. For the time being, the Anglo-Saxon monarchs were in charge, but many Danish nobles would back Norse claims to govern England from Norway and Denmark in the future if the chance came. Throughout his life, Harald would be involved with the Norse in 3 distinct regions: Britain, Eastern Europe, and Scandinavia. He was active in Norwegian politics and the military from an early age. During the early 9th century AD, when the Viking Age began, Norway consisted of several smaller kingdoms that were governed by local warlords. However, by the end of the 9th century, all of the western coastal regions of Scandinavia were united under the rule of King Harald I, or Harald Fairhair, who was an ancestor of Olaf. But upon his death in 933 AD, the realm once again split into smaller provinces and kingdoms ruled by jarls or nobles descended from Fairhair. In the late 10th century, not long before Harald was born, Olaf Tryggvason succeeded in unifying Norway under his single authority. The Christianization of his people was another of his many accomplishments. Then, in the year 1000, Tryggvason was killed in the Battle of Svolder by the forces of his arch-enemy and brother-in-law, the pagan king of Denmark, Swene Forkbeard. Following this, Forkbeard united the kingdoms of Denmark and Norway, appointing various vassal jarls to govern various regions of his newly acquired kingdom in Norway. After conquering England and removing King Athelred the Unready from power, Forkbeard eventually passed away in 1014 in the English county of Lincolnshire. So, when Harald was born, England, Norway, and Denmark were all going through a period of political and military upheaval. The Norse monarchs in Norway and Denmark were dying out quickly, and the Anglo-Saxon kings from Scandinavia. After this, Harald II of Denmark became king, and Knut of England was declared king. At least until Ethelred returned from exile in Normandy at the behest of the English nobility, until Knut was ousted from his throne. Following Ethelred and his son Edmund Ironside's demise in 1016, Knut regained his rightful place as King of England. Historians frequently refer to his domains as a North Sea empire, and he was crowned King of Denmark at the tail end of the 1010s. He also ruled Norway for a short time beginning in 1029, and even a small portion of Sweden, Pomerania, and Schleswig. In the early 11th century, while all of this was happening, no one could have predicted the consequences for young Harald Hardrada. When Sweyn Forkbeard passed away in 1014, Harald's older half-brother Olaf was about 19 years old and a seasoned campaigner. He had been on numerous journeys and campaigns around the Baltic Sea, as well as to England and Normandy. Olaf had even helped Ethelred the Unready from Normandy, a development that highlights the complicated political relationship between the Norse and the Anglo-Saxons in the early 11th century. The conflict was more complex than just the Anglo-Saxons versus the Norse. The North Sea world had been a meeting place for Western Europeans and Scandinavians for more than 2 centuries. Thus the two cultures coexisted and were allies. Olaf did these things as part of his plan to seize London and usurp King Knut's crown. In 1015, after this, Olaf returned to Norway and tried to seize the throne of Norway, which he believed to be his hereditary birthright, perhaps using the money he had earned on his travels. He returned to his native nation after converting to Christianity in Normandy. After failing miserably in England, he finally achieved triumph in Norway when he annexed the crown and won over the 5 minor kings. He became King of Norway after vanquishing his opponents, the Jarls of Leda, in the Battle of Nesjar in 1016. He ruled for more than 10 years. Due in large part to King Knut's illness while he was conquering England, Olaf was able to successfully gain the Norwegian crown. But in 1026, over 10 years later, the Danish monarch assembled a strong force that included housecarls from Denmark and England and invaded mainland Scandinavia. In 1026, in the Skåne area of southern Sweden, this first expedition against Olaf ended in the Battle of Helgia, also called the Battle of the Holy River. Knut and his combined Danish and English army nearly overcame Olaf and his Swedish ally, Onund Jacob, in this. It was the first step in a long war that would end with Knut capturing the Norwegian crown in 1029 after defeating Olaf. This action compelled Olaf to leave Norway and seek refuge in the Norse kingdom of Kievan Rus in Eastern Europe, would-be Norse kings from Scandinavia. After this, Harald II of Denmark became king and Knut of England was declared king, at least until Ethelred returned from exile in Normandy at the behest of the English nobility, until Knut was ousted from his throne. Following Ethelred and his son, Edmund Ironside's demise in 1016, Knut regained his rightful place as King of England. Historians frequently refer to his domains as a North Sea empire, and he was crowned King of Denmark at the tail end of the 1010s. He also ruled Norway for a short time beginning in 1029, and even a small portion of Sweden, Pomerania, and Schleswig. In the early 11th century, while all of this was happening, no one could have predicted the consequences for young Harald Hardrada. When Sweyn Forkbeard passed away in 1014, Harald's older half-brother, Olaf, was about 19 years old and a seasoned campaigner. He had been on numerous journeys and campaigns around the Baltic Sea, as well as to England and Normandy. Olaf had even helped Ethelred the Unready from Normandy. a development that highlights the complicated political relationship between the Norse and the Anglo-Saxons in the early 11th century. The conflict was more complex than just the Anglo-Saxons versus the Norse. The North Sea world had been a meeting place for Western Europeans and Scandinavians for more than 2 centuries. Thus, the two cultures coexisted and were allies. Olaf did these things as part of his plan to seize London and usurp King Canute's crown. In 1015, after this, Olaf returned to Norway and tried to seize the throne of Norway, which he believed to be his hereditary birthright. Perhaps using the money he had earned on his travels, he returned to his native nation after converting to Christianity in Normandy. After failing miserably in England, he finally achieved triumph in Norway when he annexed the crown and won over the 5 minor kings. He became king of Norway after vanquishing his opponents, the Jarls of Lady, in the Battle of Nesir in 1016. He ruled for more than 10 years, due in large part to King Canute's illness while he was conquering England. Olaf was able to successfully gain the Norwegian crown, but in 1026, over 10 years later, the Danish monarch assembled a strong force that included housecarls from Denmark and England, and invaded mainland Scandinavia. In 1026, in the Skane area of southern Sweden, this first expedition against Olaf ended in the Battle of Helgia, also called the Battle of the Holy River. Canute and his combined Danish and English army nearly overcame Olaf and his Swedish ally, Anund Jacob, and regain the crown of Norway. We learn of his half-brother Harald Hardrada's foray into Scandinavian politics and military at this point. At that point in time, Harald was about 15 years old, which, in medieval times, was considered a young man. At the Battle of Stiklestad, which took place on July 29, 1030, Olaf, Harald, and their other Norwegian and Swede allies encountered a larger Norwegian force of nobles loyal to King Canute. It is believed that Harald had brought 600 men to fight under Olaf's banner as they marched through Sweden toward Trondheim in northern Norway. Following intense combat, Olaf suffered 2 wounds to his knee and neck. As he lay on a boulder, perhaps overcome with fatigue and physical weakness, a spear was inserted into his chest. Then, another fighter slashed at his neck, killing him. Despite being overrun by the oncoming onslaught, the army of the previous Norwegian king was able to recover Olaf's corpse and bury him close by. However, the precise location of the burial place is still unknown. Then, legends began to circulate about supposed miracles performed by Olaf during his lifetime, his conversion to Christianity in Normandy, and his attempts to convert the Norwegian people while king. In 1164, Pope Alexander III canonized him as Saint Olaf. Harald, Olaf's half-brother, instantly succeeded to the Norwegian crown upon his death in battle. After losing valiantly with Olaf in the Battle of Stiklestad, Harald sought solace on a distant farm with a few of loyalists to recover from his injuries and plot his further actions. He crossed the Norwegian border, traversed the Swedish forests and mountains, and then boarded a ship across the Baltic Sea. Following the riverine routes of Eastern Europe, he arrived at the center of Norse habitation in the region Kievan Rus, whose capital was Kiev, the capital of modern-day Ukraine. King Yaroslav I, also called Yaroslav the Wise, was a dual prince of Novgorod in modern-day Western Russia and Grand Prince of Kiev. He reigned over a vast empire from his capital city of Yaroslav. Ingigerd, Olaf's daughter, was Yaroslav's wife. It was planned that Harald would marry Ingigerd via a marital alliance that his half-brother Olaf had arranged with the Swedish king, Olaf Skotkonung, when he was king of Norway. After that marriage plan fell through, she wed Yaroslav. However, for the marriage to take place, since she was only about 6 or 7 years old when it occurred. In order to solidify their union, Yaroslav and Harald, who it must be noted was only around 16 years old at the time, simply asked to be officially promised. Whatever the case may be, Yaroslav first turned down the proposal because he didn't think Harald had the money to pay the substantial munder, or bride price, to marry the daughter of one of Europe's most powerful lords. Harald's chances of ever returning to Scandinavia to claim the throne of Norway were also low. In the years following Yaroslav's rejection of the marriage, Harald became determined to get famous and wealthy so he could reassert what he believed to be his birthright in Norway. He joined the Kievan Rus in their campaigns against the Poles in Western Europe and various Asian groups in the Cuman-Kipchak Confederacy in Eastern Asia, along the Pontic-Caspian steppe. Miklagard, the great city in Rus language, was the metropolis that soon caught his attention. The Byzantine Empire, which succeeded the Roman Empire in the Eastern Mediterranean, was headquartered at Constantinople, which was known as Miklagard in Norse. Today it is known as Istanbul. Its Norse name seemed appropriate. While Baghdad, the seat of the Arab Caliphate, was the greatest city in the broader area, Constantinople was the largest city in Europe throughout the early Middle Ages. Upon their initial descent into Eastern Europe, the pagan Norse warriors from the north were adversaries of the Byzantine Empire. They besieged Constantinople in 860 AD and again in 907 AD, but the great walls of the Byzantine capital continued to withstand assaults from the Arabs throughout the centuries, and were widely believed to be impenetrable. The Norse or Rus of Eastern Europe had been used as an elite unit in the Byzantine troops since the reign of Basil II, the second emperor of the Byzantine Empire. Many of these people had converted to Christianity by the time Basil became emperor in 976 AD. Because of their service in that region, they earned the nickname Varangian Guard. The name Varangian means pledged sword companion in Old Norse, and generally refers to the mercenaries employed by the Norse and the Rus. During Basil's almost 50-year rule, the Varangians rose to prominence in Constantinople, where they fought valiantly against the Arabs and Turks, who threatened the Byzantines' eastern boundary. Around 1033, with Yaroslav's approval and a band of roughly 500 followers, Harald left Kiev and headed south to Constantinople, perhaps with the aim of achieving such a respected reputation for himself. Amidst a succession of 6 rulers in the 20 years after the long reign of Emperor Basil II ended, Harald would have faced rival bands of Norse warriors in the Byzantine capital. However, he only recently become ruler of Byzantium. In the years that followed, Harald and his soldiers would take part in many more important wars. It would seem that his first order of business as a Varangian commander was to root out pirate activity in the eastern Mediterranean and clear the way for ships to reach Constantinople from the Aegean Sea. Nevertheless, as we will see, his duties were gradually increased, and he would soon find himself in the front of the Byzantine army's conflicts with Arab forces in the Middle East. King Canute died in 1035 to the west, of causes unknown. He was only around 40 years old, and when Harald settled into his new life in the east, he was not brutally killed. After his passing, with the backing of the Swedish king and the Norwegian aristocracy, Magnus, who was 11 years old and the half-nephew of Harald, became Magnus I of Norway. Harthacnut, the son of King Canute and the illegitimate daughter of Olaf II and Astrid's English slave, became the king of Denmark. Nevertheless, Magnus, following the counsel of his advisors, decided against going to war with the Danish king, resulting in his being given the title of Magnus the Good, despite the fact that the Danes were mostly to blame for his father's downfall. Unlike Magnus, however, Harthacnut quickly reignited his ambitions of inheriting Norway's throne from his father. Thus, in 1040, the Danish and Norwegian kingdoms went to war with one another. The nobility of both kingdoms quickly persuaded their respective monarchs to convene for peace negotiations. Therefore, the truce did not last long. During this meeting, the two adversaries reached an agreement that the land of the first to die would be given to the other. Thankfully for Magnus, Harthacnut passed away in England just 2 years later, allowing him to reascend the Danish throne and unite it with the Norwegian one in 1042. Thus, Harald's half-nephew became king of Norway and Denmark, while he was gone in the east with the Varangian Guard. Far to the east, in the year 1040, long before Magnus had become king of Denmark, his uncle Harald had already established himself as a formidable and fearsome warrior. 2 centuries later, in his writings, Snorri Sturluson claimed that he was regarded as the commander of all the Varangians under the control of the Byzantines. By this point in time, he had fought with the Byzantine army in what is now Turkey, formerly Asia Minor, and had driven the Arabs back to the Euphrates River, in what is now eastern Turkey and northern Iraq. As part of this campaign, he helped take many Arab towns and forts. Many sources state that Harald played a crucial role in a Byzantine mission that reclaimed territories in the voyage Harald and Wheat. On their way to the Holy City, his Varangians undoubtedly paid homage to the sacred sites and may have even contributed to the restoration of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, erected around the cave believed to be the location of Christ's burial and subsequent resurrection. By robbing Arab cities and villages throughout these protracted operations, Harald accumulated a considerable personal wealth. In addition to a large fleet and a legion of Norse warriors, he fought alongside the Byzantines in a westward campaign to Sicily. The island had been governed as the Emirate of Sicily for 200 years by Muslim Berbers and Arabs from North Africa. However, in the middle of the 11th century, bands of Norman warriors, who were ultimately of Norse origin, invaded the island from southern Italy. The Normans often sided with the Byzantines in their attempts to completely expel the Muslims from the island. During this Second Sicilian War, Harald distinguished himself as a remarkable leader. When he and his Norman mercenary companion, William Ironarm, encountered resistance while trying to break into a Muslim stronghold, they eventually succeeded thanks to an innovative siege warfare strategy. Before releasing the little birds above the stronghold, they adorned their backs with wax and sulfur on broken pieces of wood. The birds immediately sought shelter under the castle's roofs. The armies of the Normans, Byzantines, and Varangians hurled combustible arrows into the fortress, setting fire to the sulfur wherever they hit it. It is said that Harald was both generous and merciless, saving those who submitted, despite his raids that pillage. However, the Norman uprising against the Byzantine rule over southern Italy reached its climax at the Battle of Olivento by March 1041. This was the first significant Norman victory against the Byzantines in the war for dominion over Italy. The Normans were headed by William Ironarm, who had been an ally of Harald's before. Combat in Italy persisted, and Harald saw action in engagements like the May 1041 Battle of Montemaggiore, where the Normans, who had long since abandoned their Norse heritage, confronted the Varangians, who were then establishing themselves as Europe's foremost cavalry strategists. The next year, while still in Italy, Harald and the Varangian Guard were summoned to the Balkans to engage the Bulgars at the Battle of Ostrovo. His benefactor, Emperor Michael IV, passed away in December of 1041, after Harald and the other guardsmen had returned to Constantinople. Michael V, his adoptive son, succeeded him as king. However, upon becoming emperor, Michael had Harald imprisoned for allegedly robbing the imperial treasury. No one knows for sure whether Harald was guilty of this or not. Some sources say he was imprisoned for murder, while others say he defiled a Byzantine noblewoman. No matter the true motivation for Harald's incarceration, it had